So, as people have talked about, we're really at a pivotal moment in the development of cities and metropolitan regions. A friend and colleague of mine at Princeton University has said we probably ought to put this in perspective and think about this in terms of discoveries that have changed our view of ourselves in the world. 1543, Nicholas Copernicus proves that the Earth is circling around the sun and not the other way around. For a while, there are people who resist that notion, and they don't really want to buy into that. 1859, Charles Darwin reveals that essentially all life on the planet is coming from common ancestors. Again, it's still taking some people time to digest that kind of process. And in 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations established, gets a Nobel Peace Prize for talking about what humans are doing to the climate, how we are, in fact, by our own behavior, changing what's happening to the climate and our planet. 2007, 2008 is also the year that somebody probably in rural China moves to a city, and for the first time in the evolution of our species, more than half of humanity is now living in cities. We go from being essentially a rural species to an urban species. Now we know that most of this, the enormous growth is happening in Asia and the megacities of South America and Africa. And we see just extraordinary growth trends happening there. China, from 1990 to 2010, goes from about a quarter urban population to about half. By 2025, we're expecting about 300 million more Chinese to move into their megacities. By 2035, they're anticipated to be 3/4 urban. Mumbai is the densest megacity on the planet, about 20,000 people living in each square kilometer. That's about 4 times the density of London. Karachi is the fastest growing right now of the great megacities. It grows by 80% from 2000 to 2010. It's over 20 million people today. So there are extraordinary movements happening around the planet. And these are both kind of bringing hundreds of millions of people into a new level of economic opportunity, but clearly creating enormous stresses and strains within those cities. Many of them are around coastal populations where they're dealing with rising sea levels and stronger storms. Of course, dealing with congestion, energy, housing. There's going to be enormous issues in these cities. I think the interesting thing I want to talk about today is that the United States is also undergoing a very profound shift in where people are living and what's happening in our nation. I think you are all probably familiar with the history of the United States in the 20th century. After World War II, GIs returned home to a very rapidly changing country. We built this interstate highway system. I think it's fairly easy to identify it on the map above me. So we built this system in the 50s, and we moved out of cities into metropolitan regions. We all started worshiping the almighty automobile. We had social transformations. As women entered the workforce, we had the civil rights movement. And so society changed very rapidly. And by the end of the 20th century, we were essentially a suburban nation. There was the 2.3 kids with the family living on their quarter acre of grass, and that seemed to be, and I grew up kind of assuming that that was going to be the history of the United States, and we were going to continue that way. But instead, what we've seen is sometime around the turn of the millennium, that trend reversed, and people are now moving back into cities and downtowns in the United States. In fact, we grew by about 100 million people from 1950 to 2000, and we anticipate another 100 million people or so to come into our country by 2050. So it'll be about the same number of people. From 1950 to 2000, these people moved into these metropolitan regions outside the cities. Where are they going to go from 2000 to 2050? What we think is that they're going to go into these areas we call mega regions. These are networks of metropolitan regions. As metro regions grow closer together, this is where 80% or more of the growth of the United States will occur. And it's happening in very different ways. There are 3 demographic drivers of what's happening here. One is the aging baby boomers. This was the population born after World War II, about 72 million people. And of course, they've kind of driven everything in the country along their lines. But as they are starting to retire from the workforce, they are moving into very different kinds of communities than the ones they grew up in. They don't want the McMansions anymore. They want to live in smaller, walkable communities that are going to serve their needs. There's also continued immigration in the United States. Of the 100 million people we anticipate by 2050, about 3/4 of that growth will be the result of immigration. And finally, there's what we call the millennials, my children. This is the population born between 1980 and 2000, about 100 million strong, and they are making very different choices about their lifestyle and what they want to do from earlier populations. So we're seeing these three trends really all pushing in the same direction. And so the United States is becoming less of a suburban nation and more of a city or town-oriented place. What is that going to mean for these places that are happening? Well, I work in New York in the tri-state region. It's the largest of these mega regions, about 50 million people, about 20% of the GDP of the country, living on just 2% of the land area in the United States. And we are anticipating real growth within this region. And fortunately, we're very well poised for that kind of growth. What we thought about ourselves in the 1980s and the 1990s was we were kind of old, cold, and crowded. We seem to get all the difficulties of the density without the benefits. But today what we're seeing is there's a lot to gain from this. Transit ridership is exploding across the United States, nowhere so much as New York City. Over the last 20 years, it's grown by about 58%. You can see how we kind of declined in transit ridership, and this growth happens to be in what we call the non-peak travel and reverse commutes. People are riding the subways late at night, on weekends, commuting from New York out to jobs in Connecticut, where we have the capacity. So this is also wonderful. I should say, of course, that vehicle miles traveled, which planners tend to pay a lot of attention to, from 1970 to 2005, it doubled. My generation drove about twice as much on a daily basis as my parents. Since 2005, it's been declining for 8 years in a row. And the younger people just don't seem to want to drive. Thank goodness. I should say, on a personal level, it's been 112 days since my daughter got old enough to get her driver's permit, and she still has no interest in going down to the motor vehicles office and learning how to drive. On my day, on your birthday, you were there by lunchtime. New York City, of course, has been doing enormous things, and you might have heard of some of these things, to kind of capture this growth and what's happening here. There's been a kind of complete streets movement under Mayor Bloomberg and his wonderful transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan. We pedestrianized parts of Broadway and Times Square and other major public spaces. Retail has shot up in these areas. We've built over 400 miles of dedicated bike lanes in New York City. 6 months ago, we instituted our own bike share program, and already we've had over 2.5 million trips of over 5.5 million riders. In fact, I have to say we now have more daily bicyclists than London does. Sorry. We're also getting ready for more growth. By 2030, New York City is anticipated to add 1 million more New Yorkers, but only if we have the capacity for those people to come in. So under the Bloomberg administration, 40% of the land area of New York City was rezoned. This is an image of the Hudson Yards, 26 acres and a rail yard that was rezoned for 12 million square feet of development, including 13,000 residential units, all on an old abandoned rail yard. And this is starting to go up fairly quickly. Of course, people need parks too, and so we've been building over 600 acres of parkland have been added to the city in the last 10 years, including, if you haven't been there yet, you ought to go check out the incredible High Line, an old abandoned rail line which transformed West Chelsea and the meatpacking district. These things have added value to these neighborhoods, made them more livable, and really made New York City an exciting and lively place to be. But of course, we have, in addition to the challenge of the growth, we're going to have to deal with climate change. And we were doing this work to try and reduce our carbon footprint even before Hurricane Sandy came ashore a little over a year ago. Sandy had a devastating impact on the tri-state region, on New York, on the entire Northeast. Over 8 million people lost power. Over 8 million people lost power, hundreds of thousands of them for several weeks. Over 100 people died as a result of the storm. It's calculated at more than $70 billion worth of economic damage. So clearly, in the aftermath of that, we've realized that our infrastructure systems need to become more resilient. We were, in a way, you could say we were trying to squeeze efficiency out of the systems that we had. And what we've thought of now is that with climate change and stronger storms and more extreme events likely in the future, we're going to have to both build the systems to handle the growth and to become more resilient as the future goes forward. This is going to mean investing in energy, water supply, efficient buildings, ways to move people around, housing, parks, education, healthcare, all of those systems. And these things are going to cost money. And so I think we are at a moment right now that a real decision needs to be made in the United States. For the first time in several generations, most Americans want to move into cities, but we've got to give them cities that they can move to. And that's going to require building more systems. Let's think about the way we used to do this. This is an image from the Holland Tunnel, which connects New Jersey to New York City in the 1920s. This was the model, the economic model for building infrastructure for several generations in the United States. We created these things called public authorities, and we gave them enormous powers. They could issue debt that was on a tax-preferred basis, so it was very cheap. It didn't cost much to borrow money for them. They had powers to override local zoning. So if they decided that something needed to happen somewhere, it didn't matter what the municipality decided. And they had the power of eminent domain, so that they could take private property if they needed it for a public good. Those are incredible powers to embed in a public institution. So we created these authorities, and they would issue debt, and they would take the money, and they would build the infrastructure, the airport, the utility system, the tunnel, the bridge, and then they would collect a user fee, a toll on that, and that would pay off the debt. Robert Moses, the famous power broker in New York City, was the one who created this kind of invention. And a little footnote that the legislators probably didn't realize what they were doing, he created this Triborough Bridge Authority and said it will have the ability to issue debt to build the bridge and from time to time issue more debt as needed. And he figured out as long as he never paid off the last of that debt, he could keep collecting the tolls and he could do it for the next project and the next project and the next project. And that was essentially how we did these things. There's also an economic model at work in this picture. And if you look up here in the corner on the side, you'll see that the Hotel Chester room is advertised for $2.50 a night. The toll that the nice gentleman is collecting from the driver there was a 25-cent toll at the time. So it cost 25 cents to get into New York City and then $2.50 to spend a night in a hotel. And there's a kind of economic ratio at work there that is broken today. No longer a hotel room in Manhattan would probably cost you close to $500, but we don't charge the tolls at that level anymore, and we really can't. And so there's a feeling that this is broken, and we can't just do this anymore. And so often people talk about how we don't have the capacity to make the investments in high-speed rail and clean energy and other systems that we need. That's not true. There are lots of ways to do it if we're just willing to step up and take care of it. And technology and user fees and value recapture all give us lots of opportunities to do this. I was kind of excited to come here today and show this slide. The obvious short-term fix in the United States would be for us to raise our gas tax. The federal gas tax hasn't been raised since Bill Clinton's first budget in the early 90s. New York residents pay 70 cents a gallon, which is the highest gas tax in the nation. New Jersey residents pay less than half that at 33 cents per gallon. And so clearly, just in the short term, raising the gas tax would be a wonderful way to invest in these systems. Every penny that we add to the national sales tax on gasoline would add $1.75 billion to our budget, and about $100 million just within the tri-state region. So New Jersey could double its gas tax and generate billions of dollars and still be at a, 20% of the UK level. The problem with the gas tax, of course, is that, as I said earlier, people are driving less, and also cars are getting more efficient, which is a good thing, but perversely means that the amount that we'll be able to get from this source of revenue is going to decline over time. In fact, we estimate, if nothing changes, that over the next 10 to 12 years, the kind of take from the New York State gas tax is going to decline by about 50%. So we're going to have to find some other ways to do this too. This is where technology starts to help. We've been working in New York to implement a congestion fee. We call it fair tolling. That's the new term of art. And we've been trying to get a system similar to New York, to London's, to Stockholm's, to Singapore's. They seem to work quite well here. It was tried twice over the last couple years. We were 3 votes short in the legislature in Albany from getting it. I should say 3 votes of currently convicted legislators short of getting it passed. We clearly weren't appealing to the right instincts to get this through. There are only 18 crossings into Manhattan into below 60th Street. It would be quite easy to implement with technology, and it's worked in other places. And we estimate it would generate about $1.5 billion a year for investing in the system in mass transit and other things. Another is what we call a mileage-based user fee. Using GPS technology, it would be fairly simple today to put a transponder in cars and charge people by the miles they drive. In New York State, every penny added to the mile driven would generate about $1.2 billion a year. So there are enormous sums that could be generated if we did this. The third thing that we'd like to think about is what we call value recapture. We know that investing in transit speeds up commutes, and that when we make it easier to get from one place to another, we will elevate property values in those communities. My colleagues at Regional Plan Association did some research looking at what happened in New Jersey when the commute to Midtown Manhattan was improved. And essentially, through a regression analysis, we were able to conclude that every minute that you knock off the commute time to Midtown Manhattan adds almost $3,000 to the value of a home within a half mile of a train station, and on out to 2 miles. You can see this very clearly. Above and beyond the appreciation of real estate, every minute you knock off will add to property values. The problem, of course, is how do we create a feedback mechanism for that? And just a few years ago, there was a proposal that was quite a big issue in the United States to build a new tunnel under the Hudson River. The current tunnel under the Hudson River, owned by Amtrak, is over 100 years old. It's the weakest link in the entire transit network from Boston to Washington. Adding a new tunnel would double the number of people in New Jersey living within 50 minutes of Midtown Manhattan, from about 750,000 to 1.5 million. It would also knock about 20 minutes off the commute for the average commuter and resident of New Jersey to get into New York City. So it would be adding by itself about $60,000 to the value of every home within a half mile of the entire system. Just an enormous amount of value. In fact, if you draw the circles and figure out what the value of that would be, it adds about $18 billion to existing residential home values in the state of New Jersey. And building the tunnel cost $12 billion. For every dollar that they spent digging the tunnel under the river, they were sticking $1.50 in somebody's pocket. But the tunnel was canceled because of funding concerns, because there wasn't enough money to do it. Obviously, there's a way to do this, but we need to create a system to take that money back in. They do this in Hong Kong. MTR, the transit authority, when they're going to extend the subway system out somewhere, they buy the land and they extend the subway and then they lease it out to developers, and that's how they finance the rest of the system. So I just want to close to say that we think that there are lots of ways we can invest in these systems. Again, for the first time in several generations, Americans want to move to cities. The trends are all in our favor, but we've got to give them cities that they can move into. I think there are lots of ways to do this. Thank you very much for letting me share this with you today.